Ladies and gentlemen, a very good morning and welcome to the DGAP morning briefing on geopolitical challenges. I'm Henning Hoff, Executive Editor of Internationale Politik Quarterly. Russia's illegal war of aggression against Ukraine, which caused us to offer these morning briefings, enters day 709. While Ukraine's situation remains difficult, its army is lacking ammunition, and there have been media reports about President Volodymyr Zelensky trying to dismiss the commander of the armed forces, General Valery Zaluzhny. And also there is the crucial special EU summit in Brussels today, which will sort of decide on financial aid worth 50 billion euros for Ukraine. This morning, we will be focusing on the situation in the Middle East. The war Israel launched in response to the unspeakable atrocities committed by Hamas on October 7th is at a critical juncture. According to reports, a deal for a 2-month ceasefire in return for Hamas releasing the remaining more than 130 hostages is getting nearer. Meanwhile, the Houthis in Yemen have continued their attacks on ships in the Red Sea. And on January the 28th, a drone strike by another proxy supported by Iran resulted in the death of 3 US Army soldiers at a US military base in northern Jordan. US President Joe Biden has said the United States will retaliate in a manner and timing of its choosing. Tehran has denied responsibility, while the United States the US administration has made clear that it doesn't seek an all-out war with Iran, but a response seemed imminent. So will we see an escalation of the conflict? And what is Germany's role or the role of German diplomacy in the crisis? To discuss this, I have the pleasure of welcoming Dr. Sanam Vakil, Director of the Middle East and North Africa Program at Chatham House in London. She is also the James Anderson Professional Lecturer in the Middle East Studies Department at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies in Bologna, Italy. A leading expert on the region, Dr. Vakil's research focuses on regional security, Gulf geopolitics, and on future trends in Iran's domestic and foreign policy, and she will give us a snapshot analysis of the current situation. Very warm welcome, Sanam. We have also with us Jörg Lau, international correspondent of Germany's great weekly newspaper Die Zeit. Previously, he was its foreign editor. Soon after October 7th, Jörg wrote an analysis titled in English, The Israel-Hamas War and the New World Order, which was the most read article of 2023, both in English and in German, on the websites of Internationale Politik and Internationale Politik Quarterly. He is a regular columnist for the German edition of Internationale Politik, and this morning he will share an assessment of Germany's role in the conflict. Welcome, Jörg. Some quick housekeeping remarks. Each speaker will offer their analysis of the current situation. After some discussion on the panel, we will open for your questions and comments about 25 minutes in. For the Q&A, please raise your hand, introduce yourself, and put your question to the panel. You're also welcome to submit questions that comes via the chat function. I'll do my best to put them to the panel. We are trying to make this briefing a little bit more concise and aim to finish at 9:15 this morning. And with a word of thanks to Jan Stöckmann from the Director's Office and as the DGAP Central Eastern European expert Milan Nitsch, both are instrumental in bringing this series forward, and as well to our colleagues at the Events and Communications Departments. Let's start with Sanam, please.
Good morning, Henning. Thank you so much for the very warm welcome, and it's a pleasure to be with you this morning. I just came back from Berlin. I was there just yesterday for a conference, and I have been following, of course, Middle Eastern dynamics for quite some time. I just want to caveat that I'm not speaking, even though I work for Chatham House and I'm here in London, I feel like we put each other in boxes too often, and I'm not speaking as a Brit or an American or as a Middle Easterner. I'm speaking to you today as an analyst and someone who understands broader trends in the Middle East. And I feel like we have to say that these days because I'm always being put in some kind of box. We are in, of course, a dangerous pattern of escalation in the Middle East because we have two very alarming and dangerous timelines and dynamics playing out. Of course, we have the atrocities of October 7th that were no doubt horrific. I should also tell you that since October 7th, the war in Gaza has also been horrific. And the over 26,000 deaths with no ceasefire yet. And although we are hearing that ceasefire discussions are ongoing, the fact that no ceasefire is still on the table and the war continues without end is very alarming. And it should be alarming for all of us as humans, for the international community, and the consequences of this war playing out live on social media is something that I don't think people have really adjusted or digested. We can come back to that. The war is alarming over 450 million people in the Middle East to a way that I've never seen before. People are very deeply disturbed that there is no pressure to bring the war to an end in a meaningful way. The issue of Palestinian statehood is of serious concern across the region. And because of statements coming out from Netanyahu's government regarding the displacement of Palestinians, this is also raising huge amount of tension and concern. In tandem with this war and the complexities involved, we have since mid-October seen a second sort of dynamic playing out in the region where theaters of tension have exploded. These theaters of tension are under pressure from the Axis of Resistance, which is an Iran-curated and backed network of proxies across the region, bringing together Hezbollah, the most important partner of Iran in the Axis of Resistance. Beyond that, of course, also Hamas, groups in Syria, groups in Iraq, and the Houthis in Yemen. And together, the Axis of Resistance has sought to take another strategy to force a ceasefire in this conflict, and that has been through escalation, taking the region to the precipice of very alarming tensions has been a coordinated effort to pressure the international community and pressure the United States to thereby pressure Israel. 4 months on, this strategy has also not led to a ceasefire. And we are seeing very serious attacks from these militia groups, particularly in Iraq and Syria. The Houthis have been very aggressive in the Red Sea. And as was already mentioned, over 160 attacks on U.S. forces has seen the unfortunate death of 3 American servicemen that are a red line for the United States. And in the past, when U.S. servicemen or contractors have been killed, we have seen a very blatant and direct American response. All of these tensions are also happening. It's important to contextualize within the context of a very serious election year for President Biden, where it is very much expected that Biden will face Trump in November, and the Republican Party in the United States has a very hawkish and persistent policy directed to not just opposing Iran or opposing President Biden's supposed appeasement of the Islamic Republic of Iran, but actually calling for military action with Iran in Iran, which is been a sort of long-standing refrain that we've heard for a number of years. So we are on the precipice of a very tense moment where the U.S. president has made it very clear he intends to respond to these attacks that have killed American soldiers. But at the same time, over the past 48, 72 hours, my timelines are blending together as this war has blended together. We have seen a very remarkable back channel and de-escalation brewing. I don't think I've ever waited so long to see the U.S. respond. And certainly the U.S. will respond. But over this period of time, we have seen very clear statements coming from Iran that it doesn't intend to escalate, that it doesn't seek a broader war. And I should remind you that Iran has made these statements repeatedly since October 7th. At the same time, we've seen the United States say it will respond, but it doesn't seek a broader war. So the public messaging is very clear that we are not moving into a multi-front war, if you will, but perhaps a contained U.S. response to push back against Iran directly across the region, to try and restrain Iranian-backed militias, particularly in Iraq, that have been attacking the United States. And again, another alarming or interesting outcome is that Kataib Hezbollah, the group that is responsible for bringing a lot of these attacks on U.S. forces in particular, has issued a statement saying that it will refrain from attacking U.S. forces also. So I expect going forward, there will be a U.S. response. It will look hard-hitting, and it will aim to be directed at these militias in order to contain the crisis. However, this response will not be one that is going to lead to a broader war, which almost all of the Middle East is aligned with the United States in trying to prevent. The difference here, and this is where the timelines and the conflicts blend together, is that the effort to contain a regional war is rubbing up against the effort to get a ceasefire. And without a ceasefire in the region, the risk of these two theaters will continue to mix together, and it will continue to raise the temperature. I should also make note, and I'm effectively messaging that I don't expect this to escalate too much further. There is one conflict zone that remains the most concerning for those of us that work and watch the Middle East, and that's the Hezbollah Lebanese border that has also thus far been contained. It has a low level of escalation. Certainly, there have been a high degree of Hezbollah fighter deaths, and the Israeli army's objectives are to push or create deterrence between Hezbollah and Lebanon. Hezbollah has violated UN Security Council Resolution 1701 and crossed over the Litani River, and the effort underway, which is also diplomatic and not just military, is to push Hezbollah back over the border to show a level of deterrence for Israel. That conflict still remains quite hot and heated, and it's very concerning for most of the region that efforts at containment there might not work. And this is tied to, of course, the Israeli government's efforts, and particularly Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's efforts to show deterrence, to show that he has a strategy that's effective after October 7th, and to try and rehabilitate himself as a political leader when he has been very personally damaged since October 7th as a political leader that presented himself as Mr. Security and saw Israel's security completely fractured, not just by Hamas's very brutal attacks on October 7th, but also because it's very clear that his Iran strategy has not succeeded, and Iran's proxy groups sit all across Israel's borders. So this is a very challenging time, and one that is, of course, posing more economic costs on the region, and raising a lot of vulnerability for specific countries across the world. So I'm going to stop right here and maybe hand the floor over to Jörg to bring in his perspective, and I hope to have a broader conversation.
Thank you very much for this sort of overview, which just reminds us of sort of how complex and how very dangerous the crisis is. Let's bring in Jörg from Die Zeit for his comments on the crisis and particularly on the German role.
Thank you, Sanam, and thank you, Henning, for the opportunity. I thought I would just really focus on German efforts to mediate in the crisis and to the maybe long-term effects that this crisis might have on German policy in the Middle East. So just some broader points here. The German government has invested heavily in the support of Israel's right to self-defense after October 7. This has led to a very sharp criticism on a European, but also on a global level of Germany being one-sided and being even tone deaf towards Palestinian suffering. Nowhere was this more evident, I think, than after the announcement of the German position on the South African case at the ICJ. Berlin said it would intervene as a third party on behalf of Israel and called the claim of genocide absurd. This led to Namibia harshly criticizing the German position with reference to the German genocide on the Herero and Nama peoples. Germany, Namibia said, should be the last nation to speak to this issue because it had been in denial about its own genocidal history in Africa for so long. And I'm mentioning this because it goes to show that the lessons of Germany's history are not that easy to draw. It's not just Israel that makes claims, but also those who want Germany to be more outspoken about Israel's conduct of the war in Gaza. And I'm mentioning this to show how much is at stake for Germany, even beyond the Middle East here. Berlin is trying to diversify its foreign policy towards the so-called global south, namely towards countries like Indonesia, South Africa, and Brazil. All of these countries harshly differ from Germany about Israel's war in Gaza. So I think the long-term costs of Germany's fiercely pro-Israel stance might prove to be really enormous. Still, the government has been willing to incur these costs. But I would say that things have been changing somewhat in the last weeks towards a more, how should I say, balanced approach. And I will get to that in a second. Let me just characterize the stance in broad strokes. Support for Israel's defense has been vocal, but not unconditional. Annalena Baerbock has been to the region, I think, 4 or 5 times now. And she has always stressed Israel's need to comply with international humanitarian law from the beginning. In one of her first trips, she gave a press conference with the Jordanian foreign minister. She defended Israel's right to self-defense, while her colleague spoke about the disastrous situation in Gaza. We later learned that both had agreed to these different roles behind the scenes. Let me mention 2 more instances. Early in the crisis, at the end of October, Germany voted to abstain in the United Nations on a resolution calling for a ceasefire. And Germany did this against vocal criticism from Israel. And late last year, Germany and the UK came out together calling for a sustainable ceasefire in a joint op-ed by Annalena Baerbock and David Cameron. And to conclude, just this week, a foreign ministry spokesperson came out very loudly against members of the Israeli government who had called for the displacement of Gazans. And I think this was criticized in terms of being against international law, and Israel had to comply with this. My sense is that the German government sees a lot of costs coming in for its stalwart defense of Israel, and not a lot of returns on their diplomatic investments from Israel. With Benjamin Netanyahu now openly opposing 2 states, I'm sure we will see more distance between Berlin and Jerusalem in the coming weeks. On a more general level, let me just state that the events after October 7 shattered German policy in the wider Middle East in a very profound way. Berlin has been trying to revive the JCPOA for years, the agreement with Iran on nuclear issues. There was not much hope left that it could be saved, but nevertheless, German diplomats have tried to keep lines of communication with Tehran open, even after the killing of Mahsa Amini, the protests, and the ensuing crackdown by the regime on the movement. Germany until today, refuses to list the IRGC as a terrorist organization, also in that spirit of preserving dialogue channels. And this was very much in line with what the Biden administration tried before October 7. All of this, I think, seems like a lost cause in retrospect, with Iran's proxies now, as Sanam just lined out, these proxies being at the center of attention in the whole region and calling the shots basically on war and peace. Germany's Iran policy is back to square one. And I think something similar can be said of the centerpiece of our Middle East policy, the support for two states. Germany has repeating the formula without actually backing it up with political initiatives. Supporting two states had become something of a lip service. Nobody really believed in its feasibility. Now, paradoxically, I think things may be shifting as a result of October 7. Because Netanyahu's idea, that's also what Sanam just lined out, his idea that he could manage and contain the conflict without a political perspective has failed tragically. And this failure of an alternative to two states on October 7 has breathed new life in the old formula of two states. Two states has become the condition for any post-conflict order. The Arab states have revived the idea that they too had practically given up on in the age of the Abraham Accords. And I think now normalization with the Arab states along the lines of these accords is no longer seen as an alternative to a political solution of the Palestinian question. Rather, the other way around, a political perspective for the Palestinians is a condition for the preservation of these normalization arrangements. This puts Germany's Middle East policy under enormous pressure. It's not enough to insist on a two-state solution in some distant future. Rather, any day-after arrangement must start with a credible political hope for Palestinian self-rule. This is the very thing that this Israeli prime minister promises to prevent. And this is why I think Germany and this Israeli government are headed for very rough times. And I'll stop here and be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Jörg. I think, again, a very concise and sort of to the point analysis of where we stand in German Middle East policy. For a long time, there was even saying that Germany didn't have a foreign sort of Middle East policy. That was sort of I think some of your comments sort of confirm it in a way. Before we open up, just one question to you, Sanam. If you talk about Iranian proxies, sort of in your view, how much are they sort of commanded and controlled by Tehran? Are they proxies really in the sense that you send them, give them orders, and they execute them, or is there sort of a certain element of freedom of movement and the maneuver that they enjoy, and sort of they are sort of in some ways difficult to control?
Thank you for the question. I think it's important. Proxy is not the right word, and I myself overuse it. These are hybrid non-state actors, if you will. And some of the groups actually are part of the state, like Hezbollah. The Houthis are legitimate, or seen to be legitimate within parts of North Yemen, certainly don't have legitimacy in a democratic sense. And many of the groups in Iraq are part of the Iraqi government and have been elected to parliament, but some of them have not. And so it's important to see the groups within their own domestic context above all. These are groups that were developed not all in one go, and they don't have the same relationship with Tehran, and they have local objectives above all, but they're united together ideologically against the presence of the U.S. in the region, against Israel and its policies that are seen to be very aggressive towards the Palestinians. And these groups instrumentalize these issues to give them more domestic power. And this is the first time we're seeing the transnational nature of the axis of resistance. So we're learning a lot more about the operations and intent, strengths and weaknesses of the axis of resistance. And in fact, it's really quite interesting because I get asked this question that you did all the time. Iran has a certain amount of influence, but it doesn't command and control the groups. These groups have a sense of loyalty to Iran, but they have a loyalty to their preservation above all. So the Houthis, for example, in Yemen, certainly have become very important for Iran, and their position on the Bab al-Mandab is, of course, hugely strategic. To think that you're going to unravel that relationship ever would be very naive. This offers Iran a unique opportunity to pressure the Arabian Peninsula, but, international shipping companies, the international community, and the same for the Houthis. But the Houthis at times have completely disregarded advice from Iran. The same goes for some of these groups in Iraq. What's very interesting is that, of course, Iran is present. It's reported that Iran's Quds Force commander Ismail Ghani went to Baghdad just a few days ago to bring down the temperature and try to negotiate a settlement, and Iran is involved. And in fact, in the statement that was released, the Kataib Hezbollah tried to take a bit of the onus off of Iran and take some pressure off of Iran while also committing not to attack American forces simultaneously. But Iran has influence at the same time. So the truth, as always, is gray. We always live in a gray world.
Thank you very much. And maybe to Jörg Lau, there has been one change, though, in the German approach to Saudi Arabia, with the sort of green lighting the export of Eurofighters, which was a very contentious issue, very, very problematic for the Green Party to sign up to Scholz work for a long time to get this sort of over the line. Is this significant, or sort of how would you see this sort of new relationship develop?
Yeah, it's a significant step for Germany. Typically, it wasn't really explained why this dramatic change in our weapons export policy was actually happening. I think many of the explanations the government gave were more or less fake, but it's obvious that the German government wants to keep Saudi Arabia in the game for the day after, when Saudi Arabia obviously is a very instrumental actor in maybe pushing Israel towards a political perspective for the Palestinians. Also, when pushing against Iran and the proxies or non-state actors that Sanam just described. So I think this is an important step for Germany. I think it should be explained by the German government to the German public how this momentous change, I mean, if you take the green position, actually came about, and they're just not doing that, which I find deplorable. I think we should have a conversation about that, about the failures of our policy and the way ahead.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Let's open up now for questions and comments, and I would sort of prefer all of you to put your questions in person to the panel. And laudably, Thomas Kleine-Brockhoff has sort of volunteered to ask the first question. Please come in.
Thank you, Henning. A question to Jörg to explore the German policy stance on this, and it comes in two parts. The first part is about the ICJ. What is your sense of what the motivation of all of that has been from in the first place? Because Mr. Scholz has put an awful lot of effort into courting sort of middle power leaders, including the South Africans, starting even prior to the Elmau G7 summit, and sort of jumping into their face in this seems to be sort of, here's the political price, and the political calculation on that isn't quite clear to me. A second element of that is sort of a German inconsistency in this, as they have also joined the Ukrainian case against the Russians. When you remember that the Russians brought a case to the ICJ claiming that there was a genocide in the Donbass at the hands of the Ukrainians, to which the Ukrainians responded with a case of their own. So to the Germans, the Russian approach in Ukraine is genocidal, while the Israeli is not. So there's I'm just wondering about what you see as the calculation here in why they are doing this. My second question is to the balance of the policy that you have mentioned. Now, balance is in the eye of the beholder. And you've made the argument that it's becoming more balanced. I would retort by saying it's been balanced from the get-go. It just depends on where you put the balance. And it is because there has been a stance, a pro-Israel society stance. I wouldn't argue that there has been any love for this government from at any point in this. And so the idea that it's getting tougher could also be turned around to argue that the credibility of Germany's pro-Israel stance now gives them the opportunity, as things go forward, to have a credible critique of that. And I would argue that the solidarity with the Netanyahu government will not last 5 seconds longer than this government lasts, for all the reasons that we know so well. So I would like you to explore the issue of balance a little bit.
Thank you very much. So if you didn't introduce yourself, I think you, Guido Goldman, chaired the German Marshall Fund.
Thank you. I'm sorry.
Let's hear then from Jörg in response, and maybe Sanam, you would also, if you could comment maybe on how German policy or the German position is perceived from outside. But maybe you have to start.
Yeah, thank you, Thomas. Be careful while driving. On the genocide and ICJ question, I actually don't think there is a really sophisticated strategy behind this thing. This seemed to me to come from an idea that you can defend that Germany doesn't want the term genocide to be overused and over-instrumentalized in settling disputes about this war or other things. But why not just let the ICJ do this and come out with a verdict, and then make your point? I guess this is what the result of this South African case will be anyhow, that they will heavily criticize the way Israel is conducting this war, while in the end, maybe not calling it a genocide. Or let's just see how this war evolves. I mean, we have to be open to all kinds of developments here. I think it was a very rash decision by Germany to come out like that, and I don't see any really sophisticated strategy behind it. On the balance issue, that certainly is the self-image of German diplomats, that they have the credibility in Israel to then criticize Israel's conduct of the war, put pressure on Israel to do something on the humanitarian side, and maybe even help the ceasefire. be implemented. But I think the second part, I'm just waiting for the second part of this, and that is really coming out much more forceful on the parts of this government that are right-wing extremists and really say outrageous things. I think Germany should be much more vocal about this, because that's also part of credibility. And now, I mean, we have this open conflict of Netanyahu with the Biden administration about two states as a political perspective. And Germany will have to take a stand here. And so I think the second part of this balance thing is coming due now, and that's, I think, I'm not against the idea of Germany being more balanced and having credibility with Israel, but now I think they have to somehow cash in the checks in the coming days and weeks. Otherwise, credibility in the wider world will be lost.
Sanam, do you share this sort of analysis, or how is Germany seen?
I do. I mean, just very quickly, I'm struck, and I think a lot of the sort of analysis that I've heard about Germany's sort of posture and position is that it's more reflective of Germany rather than being on the right side of history on this. And for Germany's long-term interest in the region, this is being processed. Germany's history and Germany's relationship with Israel, I think, requires Germany to actually be a better ally, partner, however you want to call it, by pushing Israel to think long-term and strategically about Israel's security. And when a country's closest partners can't have that conversation with it, I think that should be a moment of reflection for Germany's posture, particularly this German government that we have, that has prioritized and championed human rights and so many important value-based issues across the Middle East. This is seen as double standards, and the charge of double standards are old and wide and on all of this, but this will open up cleavages where states in the Middle East, like a Saudi Arabia that is pursuing a sort of path towards strategic autonomy, is going to be more transactional and less allied with countries like Germany on important principles going forward. And I would say, secondly, this is a broader challenge for Europe that isn't present in managing or talking about the day after in Gaza. And I think this is a huge sort of existential moment for Europe. Of course, Borrell is making some very important and strong statements, but just following the United States down the path of unilateral support for Israel isn't the way forward, because this is a regional security crisis that has consequences for Europe. I've watched what looks like a game of hot potato for 4 months, where everyone is just waiting for Washington to impose and pressure, and we're still not there. And ultimately, it's eroding multilateral institutions, trust in international values and the global order, and there will be consequences over a longer period of time that I think we need to digest now.
Thank you very much. There's Peter Linke and there's Milan Nitsch with questions, sort of putting them in person to the panel. And then I've got 3 questions also from the chat, which I would at least sort of try to throw in for a possibly final round. So Peter Linke, please.
Thank you very much. Also for the very interesting talk today. My question is the following. What's happening in the Middle East right now? To what extent is it conducive to what the Russians and others call the formation of a new world order?
Thank you very much. And could you just sort of introduce yourself, or sort of just give us a line of your
independent researcher based in Almaty, Kazakhstan.
Thank you very much. Milan, please also introduce yourself, please.
Good morning, everybody. I'm a senior expert at the Center for Different Region, so Eastern Europe, Russia, and Western Balkans. But looking at a fascinating discussion, thank you. But let me have 1.5 questions to this. The half question is about the US and British airstrikes at the Houthis in Yemen, particularly to Sanam. What effects do you see on the ground so far? Are they successful? Would they succeed in deterring more of these Houthis attacks at the ships, or on the contrary, will there be an escalation? And second question, why I ask for the floor, is about the EU's divisions on this. So you cannot accuse Josep Borrell and as the High Representative for Foreign and Security Policy and the FAC for not having enough time for this. I mean, they discussed it. Almost every second FAC since a meeting in Brussels since October was focused on this, but the results were terrible. I mean, a lot of divisions between different camps in the EU, which, and this is my question, which shows EU as not even a geopolitical actor that you want it to be, but not an actor at all. There is a talk about some kind of a naval mission in the Red Sea. So, Jörg, what do you see, and where do you see also German role and maybe leadership or attempt to steer this discussion at the foreign ministers level in Brussels?
Many thanks, Milan. I think that's already enough for you two to respond, and then I'll try and final round. I spoke to the panelists earlier. They agreed to stay a little longer. So let's address these two questions. First, New World Order and the deeply divided EU. Is it playing a role? Maybe these two. First to Jörg.
Well, I don't know if it's a new world order or disorder, but certainly this crisis is connected to many other crises we see. For example, via Iran. I mean, Iran is a major supplier for Russia in the other theater in Ukraine. Russia backs up Iran diplomatically. It's also part of a Russia-China-Iran axis that plays out in other fora. So it's obvious that there are connections here, and I think the U.S. is also involved here, not just because of the Middle East, but also because it wants to keep its influence on this emerging new world order or disorder. On the EU, just shortly, I mean, Milan is perfectly right. There are deep divisions on the issue. I mean, just take Ireland's fiercely pro-Palestinian position, and then on the other end of the spectrum, maybe Germany, with the instinctively pro-Israeli position. And the term balancing was already mentioned. I mean, I think Germany sometimes tries to balance these divisions within the EU by being a little bit more pro-Israel than this government would actually be when it just was about being close to Netanyahu or not. So it's really hard to see the EU as a player, geopolitical actor in the Middle East in the foreseeable future. Nevertheless, I think it's the German position can be important, because it's true that Germany can speak to all parts of this equation, and that might come in handy when we're talking about arrangements for the day after in Gaza and in the region as a whole. But I totally agree that the EU is not in a state in which it can be can speak with one voice here.
Thank you very much. I was recently told by Israeli advisors. They only listen to other nations. It's the United States and Germany. Whether that's true or not, or whether they just sort of like to push this message in Berlin, I don't know. But let's go to Sanam. New World Order do we seeing it emerging in the Middle East, and the EU's role is credible?
Sure. I think there was also something about the Houthis. So on the order question, I think the order is already shifting. I mean, we're in a multipolar order, and for the Middle East, that is preferable to a bipolar order. They don't want to have to pick between the US and China. They would like and are trying to encourage multipolarity so that they have strategic autonomy and choice. So that's the sort of process where we're going. The reality, though, if I sort of take both of the questions together, is that the EU, unfortunately, is not seen to be a robust, effective multilateral partner for the Middle East. The EU was once the biggest trading partner with most of the Middle Eastern countries, and that's no longer the case. China is the biggest trading partner, and the US is the primary security partner for Middle Eastern states. And the EU, because of divisions and because of domestic dynamics and priorities, just doesn't have the muscle and doesn't have the ability to work in a cohesive way, and that is an unfortunate reality for Middle Eastern states. They would like more EU engagement and more EU support, but it just doesn't manifest. And I think if we weave it into the issue of the Houthis, this maritime mission led by the US and the UK is not really proving effective, because unsurprisingly, the Houthis are still at it, because their mission is to prove that they can help bring about a ceasefire in Gaza, or look like they've stood up to the West and also taken on Israel in this context, as well as enhancing local power. But what's missing in this mission in the Red Sea, which is an international issue, it's not just an American or British issue, is the role of the EU and is the role of individual European countries. And I think it's a real shame, although I understand that there are more countries that are going to be formally joining, and perhaps Germany and other countries are going to be there, but not showing a united multilateral force to protect maritime shipping is a real failure, I think, of the Western order that can marshal support for together on Russia in its invasion of Ukraine, but doesn't on some of the other issues. And again, pointing to some of these challenges and double standards and how they're seen, this is being digested, and I wouldn't say perhaps in the best ways for countries of the Gulf, and for a country like Iran that wants to persistently be in opposition to the order. This is a great opportunity where Iran can continue to fracture and divide, not as an effective global player or regional player, but as an antagonistic regional player.
Thank you very much. And to conclude, I try to try my very best to pick up some of the questions which are in the chat for a sort of final round on your last words. I start with the last one I sort of noticed by Matthias Böhm. He's asking about reports in The Guardian and elsewhere saying that Hamas is already rebuilding its structures in Gaza, and which, of course, sort of probably leads to the question, sort of, is it possible to defeat Hamas in the first place, which was sort of the original goal of the Israeli government going into Gaza? And there's also a question by Götz Schellas. He asks about sort of which power really is calling the shots. You've already touched on that quite a bit, but we haven't mentioned China. Maybe China is interesting in that regard. And Moritz Kleff wants is curious about whether we think, or whether the panel thinks that the conflict could spill over into Egypt and North Africa. Is it sort of contagious in that direction as well? Maybe these points as a sort of to pick your brain very quickly, Sanam, and then Jörg maybe has a concluding remark. So please, go to you.
Okay. Conscious of time, very quickly, I think it has been stated quite vociferously by the analytical community that it will be almost impossible to eradicate Hamas per Israel's war objectives. Not because you can't, potentially kill 30,000 people, and Israel has almost killed 30,000 people, and certainly a good portion of them are Hamas fighters. But you can't kill the idea. And certainly through this war, you have past trauma and over to another generation that without hope or without statehood or without something to work towards, a Hamas, maybe not in its current form, will recapitalize. So it is urgent that this war ends with a cohesive, irrevocable, credible Palestinian state, to quote the Saudi government. Without that process and without progress to that end game, a Hamas is inevitable. And it could be a worse version of Hamas, for example. And certainly through that, there is deep concern that terrorist groups are going to recapitalize, and that through vacuums of power, poverty, famine, all of these things that we're watching play out, more radical elements will resurface. So I think we have to be very aware of these very bleak challenges. In terms of power in managing this crisis, I think it's abundantly clear that there is only one power of influence, and that's the United States. The Chinese are they have been longtime beneficiaries of U.S. diplomatic and military efforts in the Middle East. They have yet to marshal or deploy themselves in either avenue in an effective way. Yes, they brokered the Iran-Saudi deal in March of 2023, but all the work was done for them by the Omanis and the Iraqis. They just brought them together and pushed them over the line. So China isn't there yet, doesn't have the capacity, and why would it? I mean, the Middle East is a tinderbox of crisis after crisis. So they don't want to own responsibility. They want to be the beneficiaries of the economic relationships. So the U.S. is the key player, but it's very clear that the U.S. cannot do this alone. And U.S. credibility, alongside Germany, I might add, is certainly shattered when you are seen to be Israel's lawyer or Israel's broker in this conflict. There are 5 key Middle Eastern countries that are coming together with greater unity since October 7th. And that's important because, of course, the Middle East is competitive and conflict-driven, and there are dynamics within these states. But Jordan, Egypt, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar are playing a more instrumental role in trying to coordinate peace proposals and initiatives, and each in their own way have security challenges as a result of this war, and will take responsibility to guarantee statehood if a ceasefire is reached and if Israel commits to that process. Until those two elements are on the table, no Arab state is going to invest in security, infrastructure, or, and I would add this because this is tossed around a little too easily, normalization with Israel. The impact of this conflict among 450 million people is not adequately understood or represented. No Arab state or Arab leader is going to risk their credibility to normalize with Israel unless the conditions on the ground are such that can protect their long-term legitimacy and reputations in the region. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. We haven't sort of touched on the Egypt question, but I think maybe just a quick word to that.
Just Egypt is in a dire economic situation. It's losing $1 billion a quarter for the closing of traffic down the Red Sea. This, of course, should be alarming to Europe that really only cares about migration from the Middle East. The collapse of the Egyptian economy would no doubt usher the largest wave of migration into Europe, and it would be dangerous. The IMF, of course, is looking at providing additional loans, but Egypt is fragile, and it will not the principle of Arab states that neighbor Gaza and Israel is that they will not open their doors and accept displaced Palestinians because they do not want a repeat of 1948. It's not that they can't. They have done in the past, and they were prepared to do so. But the strong statements from the Israeli rights, Moshe Ben-Gvir, and the likes, encouraging the displacement and moving out of Palestinians from their territory is deeply harmful and a principle that really should be defended by Europeans.
Thank you very much. And Jörg, please.
Yeah, I don't have much to add. I think helping Egypt could be an opportunity for the Europeans to show some initiative here, because it's in our interest. Just maybe 3 takeaways from our discussion. Yes, the credibility of the US is severely harmed, as is the credibility of Germany. But the US is, again, the indispensable actor here, and that's a surprise for the US, but also for observers, how much here depends on the US, as in the other very important conflict for us in Europe, in Ukraine. And this is something, looking towards November this year, we should be very, very concerned about. Second thing I take away is depoliticizing the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians hasn't worked, and we need a new political initiative to maybe not solve this question, but put it on a different path, to take it away from all these non-state actors in Iran that instrumentalize it and create a lot of chaos. And the third issue, China was mentioned. China is basically absent in this crisis, and just even the Red Sea. I mean, China, that's a very important waterway for China economically, but they're just completely absent. And this is also a very interesting situation to watch, I think, given China's ambitions on the global stage. And this is quite a huge disappointment here. So these are my 3 takeaways, and thank you very much, Sanam, and everybody.
Yes, so this is something I just wanted to ask our audience to join me in thanking our 2 speakers, Jörg Lau and Sanam Vakil. Really excellent discussion. Thank you very much. Thank you all also for your questions and comments, and for joining us this morning. Next week, there are school holidays in Berlin, so we skip next week, but we will be back the week after, where we already see the Munich Security Conference coming up. So this will be a topic which is very pertaining to the conference. So thank you again, and see you soon again at the German Council on Foreign Relations. Have a very good day.